So we're talking today with Charles Behrend of Wyoming, Michigan. He goes by Bud most of the time. And the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, so Bud, begin at the beginning. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, actually at 1 block from Comerica Park on Trowbridge Avenue. I was born in 1938.
All right. And did you grow up in Detroit?
I grew up in Highland Park, which is a suburb of Detroit.
All right. And what was your family doing for a living at that point?
My father worked as a foreman for Chrysler.
All right. Now, you were very young during World War II. But do you remember anything about that era, at least toward the end of the war?
Yes, I do. I remember quite a bit. I was probably, I'm trying to think, probably about 10, 12 years old. But I remember my grandmother listening to Gabriel Heater on the radio, and they would talk about the GIs were crossing a certain parallel, and she wasn't listening. She had 3 sons over there, and they were my mother's brothers. And so there was a lot of talk about that, and I remember when they did come home on leave, and I got a chance to see some of them. But what I do remember the most, and I think it was 1943, when the war ended.
That'd be 45, but...
45?
Yeah.
Okay. When that war ended, I guess they were B-29s. They flew very low. They flew over our house, and they were throwing leaflets out of the plane that the war is over and said something else. And we were trying, as kids, we were trying to catch those in the air before they hit the ground. And I wish I would have kept one of those leaflets. But they were headed out to Selfridge Air Force Base.
All right. And then, did you finish high school?
Yes.
And what year did you graduate?
Let me think now. I gotta go back. 1956.
Okay. And then what did you do after you got out of high school?
Well, I worked different jobs. I'm trying to think. I worked in the camera shop developing film and selling camera supplies and things like that. I worked at Ford Central staff in the custodian area, scrubbing floors and buffing floors and things like that before I went in.
All right. And then what led you to enter the service?
Well, I wanted some adventure. And the area that I lived in was a bad neighborhood, and it wasn't good. I wanted to go in when I was 17 years old, but my father would not sign. He said, if something happens to you, I'll feel responsible. So as soon as I was 18, I went right down to the recruiting office, and I said, I'm going to go on my own. I wanted adventure, and boy, I got adventure.
All right.
Yeah.
So which branch of the service did you choose?
So I chose the U.S. Coast Guard.
Okay. And why did you pick them? Well,
first off, they're the smallest branch of the service, and I thought I could get more training out of the Coast Guard than I would any other branch. And it's just something that I had heard about, and I thought that would be what I would want to do.
All right. And had you done swimming or diving in school or when you were younger?
Well, when I was younger, yeah, I did a lot of scuba diving. And they knew that when I signed up. They give you a test in the Coast Guard. People don't realize, but there was only 30,000 people in the Coast Guard, the smallest branch of the service. And the Coast Guard didn't become a military branch until 1915. And they were the 5th branch of the service. And 30,000 people were in the service at that time. And when they found out that I used to do some diving, once I got through boot camp and I went on a board ship, it sent me, I was on a cutter Duane. They found out, they knew that I was a diver, so right away they told me, you're going to be the backup swimmer.
All right. So let's back up a little bit then. Okay. So you go on, you enlist, you take the test, they learn your profile and so forth. Now you say you go to boot camp. Where is that and what happens there?
Boot camp, I took boot camp in Cape Cod, New Jersey.
Well, there's Cape May, New Jersey, and Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
No, Cape May, New
there
Jersey.
You go.
I'm sorry. It's been 62 years.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's why we're here. Okay. All right. So you go to Cape May, New Jersey. Okay. So what do they do with you in boot camp? What kind of training do you get there?
Well, we did a lot of training, and beside the marching and all that, one of the things that they did do is they took us out in the ocean in these monomoys. Now, a monomoy is a large rowboat, and you would have 4 guys on each side rowing. And it took them a while to get us to understand that we didn't lock oars with each other. We had to learn to feather your oars and go in unison, and you got to be pretty accurate with it. And it did pay off later on when I was out to sea. Mm-hmm. And so they would teach you that, but they also, they taught us a lot of discipline too. And I remember when they had the big graduation when we graduated from boot camp. And I remember the captain coming by and checking everybody over. You walk down the line and just stand at attention. And I thought, I forgot to shave this morning. But he didn't notice that. He looked at me, but the guy next to me, a seagull flew over and dropped some stuff on the guy's shirt. and so the captain looked at him and he said, "Boy, you got to clean up a little bit." And then he went on, But that's what I remember in graduation.
Okay. Well, so while you were going through the training, you talk about discipline. What did they do with you if you messed up or you didn't follow an order?
Well, the different things that they would do. They might send you down to the maintenance department or into the furnace room, I guess, to shovel coal in your dress whites. And shovel coal, or they would, in one case, they'd have a guy dig a hole and put something in there and water it every day. There was nothing in the hole and this kind of stuff. But it's a little bit story that went behind that, but I can't get into all of that,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How long did the boot camp last?
3 months.
Okay. All right. And so what time of year was it when you finished that?
Well, I went in March, so it must have been sometime in July when I got out of there.
Okay. This is 1958 we're talking about.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So you complete boot camp. Now where do you go?
Okay. Once I got out of boot camp, I was sent to the 1st District. I was hoping to get the 9th District, which is the Great Lakes. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, I got the 1st District, which turned out to me to be the most exciting. I was very happy to do that. So I was stationed out of Boston, and we served our time out in the North Atlantic, and we were a couple thousand miles out.
All right. So describe the ship that you were on.
I was on a Coast Guard cutter, Duane, and unlike what a lot of people feel that the Coast Guard are ships that break up the ice, icebreakers, and put out buoys like they do in the Great Lakes. When you're out to sea like that, we are armed for battle. We had a 5-inch gun on there. We had 20-millimeter guns on there. We had depth charges on there, and so it's a little different story. And we had to practice rescuing dummies. They would throw out a dummy, and then I remember when I would go into the Monomoy, and then I would be the passenger. And when we got to the dummy, I'd have to go out, get out of the boat, and swim over to the dummy and bring it back to the boat. And when I was doing that, I looked up at the ship, and the guys were standing up there with M1 rifles pointing down at me. And I thought, that only means one thing. That means one thing, there are sharks in the water, So when I got out of there, I said, that's it. I'm not doing this again. So I put in for radioman school. I used to hang out at the Radio Shack a lot. But one of the things that happens when you go on a Coast Guard ship, they teach you every job on that ship. And that's very surprising. I didn't know that they would do that. Outside of the fact that they have specialty jobs, like you can't do a radar job, you can't do a meteorologist job, you can't do a sonar job. And these are people who go through training, and you don't do a radioman's job because you go through training for that. So what they did do is they teach us how to steer the ship. We go to the helm and we'd steer the ship. And it was very interesting because if they told you to steer the ship at 120 degrees or 170 degrees, we'll say, and you turned it to 170, and then you got to go back to 130. Well, when you're going back to 130, the ship is still moving toward it. It's going past 170. So you've got to learn before it gets to 170 to turn the wheel back the other way. So they could tell by the wake of the ship if whether or not you were really steering that ship. It was zigzagging all over. They wanted it nice and straight. So eventually I got pretty proficient at that, and then one of the proudest moments I had was when
we went down to Cape Cod Canal, and the quartermaster told me, he said, Behrend, you're taking over the wheel here. We were only going 2 knots, so we weren't going very fast. So I took the wheel, and I was really proud. I'm going down the Cape Cod Canal. I couldn't believe it, and I'm steering the ship, you know. Then when we came into port, I said, uh-oh. I didn't want to dock this thing. I'm afraid I'd run into the dock. Quartermaster, he knew that. He said, okay, now I take over. And he took that thing and brought it in with a breeze, no problem at all. But that was kind of exciting for me to be able to do that. So that was one thing that was really nice.
Okay. So how long did you spend on that cutter before you went to radio school?
Probably about 4 months.
Okay. Now, when you're out to sea, what kind of sea conditions were you sailing in?
Oh boy, we had some real gales out there, some rough seas, and this was the North Atlantic. The water was cold, but we would hit some rough seas, and they would tell you, if you're out on the deck, the speaker would be turned on, and they would tell all hands clear the deck, all hands clear the deck. And you better clear that deck, because if you don't, you're going to get caught up there, and you're going to get swept off the ship. So you immediately drop down into the hole until that, and the last guy down batches the hatches, and that seals off any water from coming in. But if one guy is left up there, and you got 50, 60 guys down there, they're not going to give up their lives for one guy. They're going to leave you up there. So when they tell you to clear the deck, you clear the deck, so you don't fool around with that. So we did have some rough seas where actually the mast of the ship hit the water. They had to repair the mast of the ship, and now that was quite a ways up. So we did have a lot of rock and rolls out there. So when we hit some rough seas, we had some rough seas out there.
Okay. Now, you've been done diving. I mean, had you done any sailing or boating on the Great Lakes before you went to the Coast Guard?
No.
Okay.
No, I did some diving in different lakes.
Okay. So when you go out to sea, did you get seasick?
No, I thought I was going to the first day, but they told me just keep on working, and I didn't. But we did have one fella that hung over the slop chute all the way, and we dropped them off in Newfoundland and left them there for several months and picked them up on the way back. The guy was so sick, you know, but I didn't have any problem with seasickness.
Okay. All right. Now, during that first 4-month stretch, I mean, aside from sailing the Cape Cod Canal and being in the rough weather, are there other particular things you remember about that phase?
Well, I remember I seen some, well, let me just tell you this. When we were out to sea, and we're a couple of thousand miles from land, and the sky at night was just pitch black. And we had a few running lights along the deck. And I remember that I went down, I walked along the walkway of the deck there to the aft part of the ship, and I laid down. And I looked up at that sky, and what I saw, I can't hardly explain what I saw. The stars in the sky, the colors, and it was unbelievable because there was no light around there. You could see it, and I would think, God, tell me there's no God. I mean, you knew there was a God. This wasn't the Big Bang. There had to be a God that made all this. So that was something I always remember, seeing that sky at night. It was quite a thing.
Were you seeing auroras as well as the stars, or?
No, I don't remember seeing any of that. But one of the experiences that I did have one time, I was up on we did every different kind of a job. When we had man overboard, my job was to get the water, fresh water, if we had abandoned ship. And we also learned that when that ship goes down, you got to get quite a ways away because it's going to pull the water down with you. And you're going to go in. So that was one of the things I had to do. And the other thing, we learned the 20 millimeter guns that would fire from overhead for airplanes. We never shot them off, but we practiced with them. I was a sight setter in the 5-inch gun, which is a big gun that mounted on the bow of the ship. And my job was to sit up on a stool with a headset and they would tell me how many degrees it turned it this way and that way, and I would get the gun lined up, and then I'd say sight set, and then they would yell fire. Well, then I would yell fire, but we never fired it, because the reason for that is prior to that, they would fire that gun, and the guys would come out of that gun. It's in an enclosure. They would come out of there with their nose bleeding. And so, so anyway, I got through that, and then there were different things that I was on lookout one time, and I was standing up above the quartermaster deck, and you got nighttime binoculars, and I'm looking around. This was at nighttime, and it was getting just a little before morning, but it was still pretty dark out there. And I looked out off the starboard bow, and I saw a little flicker of flame. I said, oh man, there was a fire out there. So I called down to the quartermaster, and I said, hey, there's a fire off the starboard bow, and I gave him the coordinates, because we had a gyroscope up there, and I would told him what the coordinates was. And he came out, and he looked, and the next thing I know, everybody's up there. The captain is out there, everybody's out of bed, you know, and they're all looking for this, and they all got their binoculars out. And I said, I see it again. And so we got the ship going full steam ahead. We're heading out for that. And finally the quartermaster says, hey, look, I'm going to go check myself. I don't know if he's seeing anything up there. So he comes up. He says, yep, I see it. There is a fire out there. We're going full steam ahead. The captain's yelling at the guys in the radar room, you got anything yet? And they say, no, sir. Well, let me know when you do. Well, what it turned out to be was the sun coming up.
Oh.
Yeah, it was quite an experience, but one of the things I thought, boy, I'm going to hear about this, but the captain told me, son, he said, we knew you were doing your job. Mm-hmm. That's what's important, and that was good. But that's one of the memories that I have on that. And I do remember another incident when I was, well, I did go to radioman school. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
You want to, and in the radioman school, we were there for 6.5 months.
Okay.
And for 5.5 hours a day, you did nothing but copy code except on the weekends. And then during the weekends, you would study. And you studied how to repair your radio if you had a problem with it and stuff like that. Well, it got to the point where when you studied the code, we started off at a class of 43, 11 of us finished. And it wasn't that the other guys weren't smart, it's just that the code drove them crazy. And they went into other areas. They went in, maybe become a meteorologist, or they studied to be a sonar operator or radar operator. Mm-hmm. And so they went into other fields. But what I found that this is probably something that a lot of people don't really think about, but when you do the code, you learn it's not just the dots and dashes, it's the rhythm of the code. And that's what makes the difference. For instance, I can tell you that if I did the letter N, it's a dot it. If I do two N's, it's dot it, dot it. But a C is a dot it too. So how do you differentiate? Well, the C is dot it, dot it, dot it, dot it. It's the rhythm. Mm-hmm. And if I send an MI and IMI, that means a repeat. You don't go did it, da did it. It's diddy dum dum diddy, diddy dum dum diddy, and you do that 3 times, and then they'll send back. So once you learn that rhythm, then you're pretty well set. I struggle a little bit with 22 words a minute. That's what you had to have to graduate. I did get through it, but 24 and 26 was a breeze for me because the rhythm was better for me. And so that's what I did, and I went back to the ship, and a very interesting time. I was on the ship, and as a radio operator, we would take in a lot of messages of the weather reports and send that up to the captain, so we knew if we were going into a storm and where to turn the ship and where we were going to go. Strategically, the Coast Guard ships are stationed all over different parts of the Atlantic, and then you could call one ship or after another. But I was there one time, and you have a headset on, or on my one ear here, I've got NLKL. That's the ship, the number of my ship. Somebody's calling specifically to my ship. On this one, it's anybody calling in, whether they want help or they want some information on the weather. That's different. Then overhead, we had a speaker, and that was voice. And so one day, I'm sitting there, we're doing the code, and I just kind of finish up with a message on the code, and I hear a voice come over. And it's an English guy. And he says, how you chaps doing down there? And there's an airplane flying overhead. And I said, well, we're doing okay. He says, you chaps okay down there? I said, yes, we are, you know. And I said, where are you going? He says, I'm going to New York City. And I said, would you do me a favor when you go to New York City? He says, what could I do for you, mate? I said, I'm going to give you a phone number. Would you call my folks and let them know? They haven't heard from me in 4 months. They probably wonder what's going on. So he said, I'll do that for you. So then, I don't know whether he did, he didn't, but several months later, I came home on leave. And my mother said, you know, the strangest thing happened. Some English guy called here and told me that you were okay. He said, how he know you're okay? And I had to explain the whole story to her, you know. But
Okay.
these are some of the memories that I had out there, you know, I'd
Right.
say.
Now, you were mentioning hearing, you know, calls for help and things like that. Did you do that? Did you go help ships in distress or anything like that?
When I was there, we didn't have any. Just before I went on the ship, I was waiting in transit for my ship to come in. And I hadn't been on that ship yet. I was going to go on it as soon as they came into port. They were delayed. And the reason they were delayed, you remember you heard about the Antrodoria went down? Well, the Stockholm ship, the Swedish ship Stockholm, sank the Antrodoria. They hit them broadside. The Swedish ship was a bigger ship. And it hit them broadside. The Antrodoria was, I guess it was from Italy.
Yeah.
And they sank that ship. And the Coast Guard cutter Duane was the first ship on there, on site, and saved these people. They came aboard. And before that ship went all the way under, they were able to get them aboard the cutter Duane. And they brought them in, gave them dry clothes, and fed them, and took care of them, and brought them back, you know. Probably brought them back to Boston, I guess, and I don't know what they did with them after that. But it was, if I had been there just a little sooner, I'd have been part of history.
There you go. All right. Now, did you, would you spot other ships, or were you always by yourself?
No, more often than not, we were by ourselves. Once in a while, we'd see another ship, but usually we stayed away from other ships. What I did get the chance to see was some of the things that I would never have seen otherwise. I seen some huge whales, blackfish, see a lot of sharks, and we would throw our garbage down a slop chute. The porpoises would be there eating that all the time. And so you got to see all that kind of nature. And the one thing that surprised me, Jim, is that one day we were out to sea, and I look up and I see this bird come, and he lands up on top of the mast. And I said, where did that bird come from? We're at least 1,000 miles away from land. Where did the bird come from? He couldn't have flew all that way. So we got to thinking about that. I said, well, some of the people were telling me, well, maybe it was the Holy Spirit. I said, I think maybe he came from another ship. That's all I could think about. But I was surprised to see that bird land there like that.
Was it a pretty big bird, or just?
Yeah, it was I don't know what it was. You know, he was up quite high. I couldn't see it.
There are birds that can soar very long distances on the thermals and things like that, and albatross in particular, those can show. But
they just float in the
yeah,
airstream.
yeah. So that, you know, so that actually it is possible. But if you didn't see it very often, then not many of them are doing
No.
it. Yeah.
No.
Now, did you? Was part of your mission a kind of Cold War mission? Were you looking for Russian planes or submarines or things like that?
We did have a Russian sub underneath us, and we called down to it, but it wouldn't respond. They were playing war games with us. So it just went on. They kept following it. Wherever we'd go, they would go, and they stayed there for quite a while. And then I don't know whether they just disappeared or we started heading back into Boston. And you know, when I mentioned at the beginning of the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard started off as a revenue cutter service. Okay. And their job was to intercept these smugglers that were coming in. And that's basically where the term came from. And then eventually the Coast Guard was used to guard the coastlines of America. And about a couple of months after the Second World War started, Coast Guard ship going along the coastline of Carolina found a German sub. And they sank that sub. It was a Koskas, I think, was the ship, the Koskas ship was a Coast Guard ship. And they sank that sub, and the reason the sub couldn't get away because the sub tried to go down and maneuver, but the water was only 120 feet deep. So they got caught down in the muck, and they couldn't. They had to surrender. So they came up and they brought all these prisoners. They said it's the first time in history that the United States had prisoners of war in our own homeland, and we had prisoners of war there. But the Coast Guard, they did their job that way, and I do have some pictures, and you'll get a chance to see that maybe later, of the Coast Guard ship, and you'll see that we did have the guns on there. We had what we needed. We had depth charges on there, and we were ready to fight anytime we had to. Now, the Coast Guard were basically escort ships for the supply ships, like I said, and during that time, there was a German sub that tried to shoot down, or shoot down a supply ship, and the cutter Duane, along with the cutter Spencer, one on each side of the supply ship, they both put in depth charges, and they sank that German sub. And there were 3 or 4 guys that came above the Duane, the cutter I was on. And incidentally, the Duane was named after Andrew J. Duane, D-U-A-N-E, and he was a Secretary of the Treasury under the 7th President, Andrew Jackson. And that's how far back. In 1915, the Coast Guard became part of our military, and we were the smallest branch. And if you go during wartime, if you joined the Coast Guard, you could go on a Navy ship, because under the case of crisis or war, the Coast Guard falls in with the Navy, and you become part of the Navy. And we did have guys in the Coast Guard that went to Navy SEAL training, was trained with the Navy SEALs, but they were Coast Guardsmen. The Coast Guard. That's another thing that, and when the people used to call us, if we went into town, we run into the Navy, they would call us the hooligan Navy, and we always said, hey, just hooligan, leave out the Navy, okay? And that's just one of the things, But I wanted adventure, and I sure got it.
All right. Now, are there other particular things that stand out in your memory from your time at sea?
Well, I think that probably the things that stand out the most were the rough seas. They were very, very rough. And the water coming up would be a mist, and it'd freeze, and freeze your eyelids shut if you're on lookout there.
Okay. Yeah, explain that a little bit. You told me before the interview that basically that they trained you to do all the different jobs in the ship, and one of the things they did, they send you up to the bow of the ship, and that wound up affecting you in some interesting ways. So can you kind of tell that story?
Well, when I was at the bow of the ship, the water would splash up like a mist, and it would cover your face, and eventually it would freeze your eyelids shut. And then I'd have to go in a room and get it thawed out, and another guy would take over. And the reason we were at the bow of the ship, we were looking for anything floating in the water. Could be a piece of cardboard, a piece of wood, anything you saw. And that was your job. Then the guy that would relieve me, his eyelids would freeze shut, and then he'd come back in, and then I would go back out. And then eventually, I noticed that my left eye, even to this day, it waters every once in a while. Water. And it never started before that. So that has something to do with it, I think. And so eventually I went back, they sent me to the Coast Guard Academy because they wanted me to go to Loran Station, which is an uninhabited island. Well, there's some people in there, but not very many. And you're there for 2 years with a couple other people. You would be there with another person that would be doing radar, and somebody was a meteorologist would be taking the weather, and then yourself, and then somebody that could repair the equipment would be there, and that would be it. 4 or 5 of you would be there, and you're there for 2 years. And so because of that I was having that problem with this eye, they decided not to send me there. And they eventually decided that the best thing for me would be to go back to Groton, Connecticut, and teach the Morse code, and that's what they did until they discharged me.
Okay, and that's the Coast Guard Academy is based there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And so then I became a radio operator, and then I never would have dreamt that I'd be back there teaching it, but I did. And you don't realize that on the keyboards they're not lettered, they're just blank keys. You just have to know by feel, and that's all part of it. And yeah, it's just learning the rhythm of it, and we learned a few things when we went through radioman school, that if I had to get a weather report coming in from Boston, we'll say, Boston would send it to another ship, and then it would back to us, you know. And I knew we had a little code set up so that if my buddy was on this other ship, and he might be somewhere out where we were out in the North Atlantic, I'd go like a little dit-dit, he'd come back with a dit. I knew that was him. And so I'd say, what did you get on your weather report? And I would cut it short, and I would check and see if that's what I got. Same thing. Yeah.
Now, were there people that you regularly communicated with that way? Or did you not usually know who you were talking to?
No, I never knew who I was talking to. I mean, other than just the people on the ship there. Yeah, that was different. And the other thing that was very interesting to me is that when I first went on the ship, I was a deck ape. That's what they call you. You're out of boot camp, you're a deck ape. You do whatever they tell you to do, you know. When I came back from radioman school, I outranked the guys who were in charge of me. And that was a little different, so that was kind of nice. But you know, to this day, it's been over 60 years, I know that code inside out. I'll never forget the code, you know.
All right.
So.
Now, did you want to stay in longer?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. I wanted to. I thought, listen, I'd like to finish my full term. I'd like to be in a little bit longer. But they said, no, we can't take a chance on it. They were worried about this eye. And it never really changed. It's just that it waters once in a while.
All right. So now you're discharged. It's like the end of 1959 is when you get out, basically?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're getting most of 2 years.
Yes, little over 2 years. And then they gave me an honorable discharge with all military honors and the GI Bill and everything. And the interesting thing is, a few years after that, I was home, and I was married, and I had 2 little boys. And we were having dinner one day, and my phone rang, and it was the VA. And the VA says, Mr. Behrend, you know you have the GI Bill, but we see you haven't used it yet. Are you interested in going to school on the GI Bill? And I said, well, yeah, I would. So I went to Grand Rapids Junior College, and then I went to Aquinas College on a GI Bill. And I thought, you know, why not? I mean, I was kind of excited about that, you know.
All right. So what had you been doing by way of work after you got out of the Coast Guard?
Well, when I first came out of the Coast Guard, I had a job where I would repair office machinery, where I would travel around the state. These were machines, newspaper printers and stuff like that. They would print your name and address on there. We'd have slides that the ladies would type up, and they would go down in the machine, and they would just label them. And I would repair those machines when they broke down. But after that company folded up, and then I got a job at Kelvinator, and then I worked on Kelvinator. I started off in production, then I got into, I was in security police for Kelvinator, or they call it plant protection too, I guess. And I spent about 7 years after I was in there. Then they made me the sergeant, and then after that, I ended up over in personnel as personnel coordinator, and I stayed there for quite some time. And then I went to they had a kind of a session for workers' comp in Lansing, and they brought people in from all over the country to go to that, and it was kind of crowded. And when I was there, I bumped into these 3 guys, and they were talking to me and where I worked, and I told them, and they said, what are you doing about workers' comp? I said, well, we're self-assured, self-funded, we're all set. But what I didn't know, a couple weeks later, I get a call. The one guy that I was talking to is the owner and the CEO of a company in Detroit, and the other two guys were executive vice presidents. They were interviewing me, and they wanted me to come down to Detroit. So I went down there, and they were talking. Well, we're gonna, you know, we know you're a veteran, and we know that what you've done, because I've done a lot of work, you know, in the field, and they said that they wanted me to come and work with them, and you work out of your home in Grand Rapids, because we got clients all over the state, and they offered me a salary, and I thought he's talking about a month, and I said, well, that's more than I'm making a month now. They were talking bi-weekly. And he said, and before you leave, by the way, he says, we're going to give you a new car every year, company car, so you never have to worry about a car. And we're going to give you a credit card. And use that, take your clients out. So I was living a life of Riley there for a while, you know. And I moved up. Eventually, I became the vice president of 2 different companies. And until I retired about the age of 66, just before I turned 66.
Okay. Now, so when you went to school, were you still working while you were taking classes?
Yes, and that's an interesting thing that you brought up there. I was working full-time at Kelvinator, and I worked late. In the school, I went to Aquinas College, and I took classes. They were nighttime classes. So if I took business law, it was taught by attorneys. And when I took accounting, it was a vice president of, at that time, Oak Kent Bank. And different people were professionals in the field, and that's where I learned it. So after about 2 years of that, I told my wife, I said, you know, these little boys, my little boys, are growing up, and they don't have a father. I'm working all day, I'm in school all night, I study all weekend. I said, this is gonna stop. So I dropped out of school. I said, I'll finish it later. Right now I'm gonna. So my older son was in Indian Guides, and I joined Indian Guides with him and marched down Clyde Park Avenue with police escort, and I was dressed up like an Indian, just give him, you know, I was in it. The younger son, he was in Cub Scouts, and I went with him there. I spent time with him. I took him out to Reed's Lake. We went ice fishing. I took him out flying kites, played baseball with them. They still remember all those good times that we did, and we had a lot of fun, and I never forgot that. And I never, as it turned out, I needed another, I only had 60 credits. I needed another 2 years if I was going to get my bachelor's, but I never needed it because I got one job after another. And like I said, I got 2 companies offering me the vice presidency, and I was doing better than if I would have got my degree. It worked out good. God was looking after me, you know.
All right. So kind of, if you look back at the time that you spent in the Coast Guard, how do you think that affected you, or what did you learn from it?
Well, you learn a lot of discipline, for one thing. You know, you learn when you get an order, you follow through on it, and you do follow through. You don't shortcut anything. You do what you're told to do, and you learn that. But you also, I had the feeling that I wanted to learn more than what I was getting. I needed to know more about it, and I'd hang out at the helm sometimes and with the quartermaster and learn a little bit about how he steered the ship. And I hung out in the radio shack, and when I had time, I'd go in there, and I was just fascinated by these guys, how they were typing all this stuff up. And they said, well, you can learn it too. So I put in for radioman school, and I went there, and that was kind of exciting for me to go to radioman school.
Right. And, where did they do the radio school?
That was in Groton, Connecticut, or New London, Connecticut, which is right next to Groton, New London, Connecticut. We had a base there, Coast Guard base there, and that's where we went to school.
All right. Okay, then. I think that gets about to the end of the story here, so I'd just like to thank you very much for taking the time to share it today.
Yes, I'm glad to do that. I hope that I give some people a better idea what the Coast Guard is all about. They are fighting ships too. They're not just buoy tenders and icebreakers. Right. Okay, this is a picture of me when I was probably about 20 years old in the Coast Guard. See, I had some hair, you know, but you see, we wore the same uniforms that the Navy wore, both the dress whites and the dress blues. We had the same exact uniforms on. And then I have a picture here I wanted to show you. of the ship that I was on. At the front of the ship, you can see there's a 5-inch gun on there.
Right.
On the upper deck there are 20mm guns up there for firing. And on the port side that you can't see in this picture, you're looking at the starboard side of the ship. On the port side, we had depth charges on there. And this is the equipment we used to fight if we had to. And it was what we used when we sunk a German sub, you know. Not when I was on there,
Right.
but prior to me being on there.
Yeah. And you did your practicing with gun positions, but just not
Yes.
firing the guns at that point.
Right.
I think that gets about to the end of the story here. So I'd just like to thank you very much for taking the time to share it today.
Yes, I'm glad to do that. I hope that I give some people a better idea what the Coast Guard is all about.